Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythology. On this episode, we are tackling probably the biggest conspiracy theory ever. This is probably the spark point that really launched the term conspiracy theory, and it's amazing it's taken me over 2 years to get to this subject, even though I've been planning this since season 1. We are, of course, talking about the Kennedy assassination. And as always, we will get to the assassination, but I also want to use this time to dispel some other myths about the Kennedy family because they were seen as almost American royalty at the time. They've always been America's golden family with a long legacy, and their lives have been riddled with tragedy and myth, so we're going to dispel and unpack all of that today. We're also going to dive into a discussion about his assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, and his life and his motivations, and a lot of the theories around his involvement. So this is going to be a big episode. So on that note, let's start at the beginning. So the beginning of the Kennedy legacy in American politics really starts with John F. Kennedy's grandfather, a man named Patrick J. Kennedy. He was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1858 to Irish Catholic immigrants who had come over during the potato famine, so that second great wave of Irish immigration to America. He was the youngest of the 5 children. His father died only 10 months after he was born, and being the only surviving male of the children, he was the first in his family to receive a formal education. His mother, a very hardworking woman, was working in this stationery and notation shop, and she eventually saved up enough money where she purchased it, and she expanded it into a grocery and liquor store. At the age of 14, young Patrick, he leaves school to help support his mother and his 3 older sisters in this grocery and liquor business. By taking a job as a dock worker on the Boston docks, he is eventually able to save up enough money to purchase his own bar, or if we want to be contemporary with the time, a saloon, but he purchases this saloon in Haymarket Square. And this is the start of his own success as a businessman. He then ends up purchasing 2 more saloons, one of them being in the Maverick House, which is this upscale Eastern Boston hotel. And to be honest, by the time he's 30, he's basically achieved the American dream. He's the son of Irish immigrants. They worked hard their whole lives. And he's successfully running these businesses, which eventually allows him to buy a whiskey importing business. He gets married, he has 4 kids, one of which is Jack Kennedy's father, who we'll get to later, and he decides to dip his toes into politics. And he really lays the groundwork for the Kennedy family in politics, which still goes on to this very day. So Patrick, he maneuvers his way into the Massachusetts Democratic Party, and he winds up in the state legislature. He served 5 consecutive 1-year terms in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, and then 3 consecutive 2-year terms in the Massachusetts Senate. And he's becoming a leader in the Massachusetts Democratic Party, which was the minority party at the time. However, he found campaigning and speech making and legislative maneuvering and all that fun stuff to be really dull. He was more attracted to the behind-the-scenes, backroom machinations, those closed-door deals that you make with your fellow politicians in order to guide the political landscape. A lot of it's corrupt, but to be honest, doing it that way is how stuff gets done in our system, because if you believe that above-board method works, then you are very naive as to how our system works. So by 1895, he's really retired from the legislature, and he spends the rest of his political career in all these appointed positions. He's a fire commissioner for a while. He's a member of the Democratic Party's unofficial board of strategy, which is basically like a think tank, which is meant to kind of guide what direction the party should be going in. And over the next 30 years, he continues to build his wealth. By the time of his death, he held interest in a coal company. He held substantial stock in some banks, the Columbia Trust Company. The guy was really the one who built the Kennedy legacy. And his son, Joseph Kennedy, would really capitalize on that and push the Kennedys further into the political sphere. So then we get to Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr., and he's the man who everybody states is the patriarch of the Kennedy family and did all this stuff and shot them into prominence, which is true, but he's really building on the legacy his father left behind. To be honest, I think it's just easier storytelling to start with Joseph as opposed to his father. However, Joseph, he was born September 6, 1888, into the prominent Kennedy family, who were rising stars in the Democratic Party at this point. Joseph attended the Boston Latin School and was nominated as class president. He then goes on to Harvard College, where he graduated in 1912 with a bachelor's degree in economics. In October of 1914, he marries Rose Fitzgerald. She was the eldest daughter of Boston's mayor at the time, and the two would eventually go on to have 9 kids. His first job after graduating Harvard was that as a state-employed bank examiner, which gave him great insight into the banking industry. And as someone who worked in that industry up until very recently, I can tell you, most people have no idea how that industry works. It's fascinating, but I'm not here to talk about banking today. In 1913, the Columbia Bank, in which his father held a significant share, was under threat of this kind of corporate takeover, and Joseph ends up borrowing the equivalent of $1.3 million, so back then it would have been about $45,000, in order to wrestle control back away from this takeover. And he becomes the president of that bank, and at the time he would boast that he was the youngest bank president in American history. By 1917, he was elected to the Board of Trustees of the Massachusetts Electric Company, which was New England's leading public utility at the time. So this guy, he's come from wealth and he's just building upon that wealth. Throughout his career, the Kennedy wealth would just increase vastly. Joseph makes a lot of money off of real estate investments. During the tail end of World War I, when America's really starting to get involved, which to be honest, himself, like most Americans, kind of opposed. He realizes that this would be good for his business interests, so he becomes an assistant general manager of Fore River, which was the steel shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. And he's overseeing the production of naval transports and warships. And it's through this job where he becomes associated with the infamous Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was the Secretary of Navy at the time. After the war ends in 1919, he joins the Hayden and Stone Company, which was this stock brokerage firm with offices in Boston and New York. And this was in the 19-teens and 1920s, so this was the Wild West of the stock market. There's no regulation or oversight at this time. So he excels in things like insider trading and stock manipulation, because there's no rules saying you can't. Now, this unregulated craziness would eventually lead to the stock market crash, but we'll get to that later. But it's in 1920 where he's almost killed, because a lot of people don't remember this or know this, but on September 16, 1920, there was a bombing on Wall Street. They tried to blow up the stock exchange. If I recall, it was this hardcore anarchist guy who set off this car bomb. But Kennedy was right there on the corner and was actually thrown to the ground during this blast. And this blast immediately killed 30 people. It left 143 seriously injured. 10 more would die of their injuries. And if you go to the stock exchange today, you can still see the scars from this bombing on the side of the building. But if Kennedy had just been maybe a few feet closer, or maybe on the opposite side of the street, he possibly could have been killed in this blast. And who knows, maybe the Kennedy legacy would have ended on that day with him and they'd just be a minor footnote in history. But he survives this terrorist attack and he goes on to be a rock star when it comes to the stock exchange. By 1923, he creates his own investment company and he is very successful in it. And throughout the 1920s, his wealth increased to about $4 million. Of course, by 1929, he was one of the few who saw the writing on the wall before the crash. He knew that it was a good idea to get out of the stock market. This is mostly because he understood the machinations, the insider trading, and the fraud that was leading to this big bubble that was about to burst. In one anecdote, he says, possibly as a joke, that he knew it was time to get out of the stock business when he started hearing stock tips tips from his shoeshine boy. But old Joseph, he's shrewd enough where he actually benefits from the crash of the stock market. So what he does is he starts selling his assets short, which is kind of counterintuitive when it comes to stock trading. It basically means that you're going to profit even if that stock falls. If you want to know more about that, just go read a Wikipedia article about it or something. I'm not going to dive into that here. But in doing it this way, he actually increases his wealth and becomes a multi-millionaire as a result of the stock market crash. He goes from having a net worth of about $4 million, which is the equivalent to about $77 million today, to accumulating a net worth of over $180 million by 1935, which is the equivalent of about $4 billion today. He acquires enough money to establish multi-million-dollar trust funds for his 9 children, which would sustain them for the rest of their lives. However, the dude still had great ambitions for himself and his children. And of course, the Wall Street stuff was just kind of the tip of the iceberg when it came to his investments. He had enormous investments in Hollywood and in real estate. And once Prohibition was repealed, he got into the old family business of liquor importing. Now, a lot of people will attest to the myth that during Prohibition, he was running bootleg liquor along with rum runners and I guess the mafia or whoever. But to be honest, none of that's actually true. I think that story probably was misconstrued from the fact that his father owned several saloons and was involved in a liquor importing business. And since historians tend to generally ignore his father, they just attribute it to Joseph. Of course, how he made money on liquor importing was by mostly importing high-priced scotch, which he made a very healthy profit off of. Because he wasn't after that crowd of people that you would see at a bar on Saturday night, the working class guys. No, he was after that wealthier client base. The millionaires and social elites who would pay for overpriced imported scotch. I'm sure the profit margins at the time were insane. Of course, all of this would lead Joseph to his own political career. So in 1932, Kennedy, being from a family who had heavy involvement in the Democratic Party, supported Franklin Delano Roosevelt in his bid for the presidency. He donated money, he went out and raised a substantial amount of money in order to get FDR elected president. Pretty much the same way millionaires and billionaires influence elections to this very day. And one of FDR's policies early on is to establish the Independent Securities and Exchange Commission, which was meant to regulate the markets, regulate the stock market, pretty much anything financial. It's regulated by the SEC, in an attempt to prevent anything like the 1929 stock market crash from ever happening again. And of course, at this time, they had a list of candidates for the chairmanship of the SEC, and Kennedy was at the top of that list. They basically said, well, due to your experience and your business acumen, you are the man for the job, even though your practices directly led to the crash. Now, initially, you're probably thinking what I'm thinking, well, you're just leading the wolf to the sheep pen. But then in hindsight, it's like, well, who better to spot illegal practices than a criminal who participated in those illegal practices? And to be honest, I used to see a lot of this in the financial industry. The people who do the best and are able to detect fraud and stuff like that are the same people who pretty much live in that sketchy gray area of the industry. So they already know what to look for. And that's all I'll really say on that subject. But as chairman of the SEC, Joseph takes it seriously. He does an excellent job. He cracks down on insider trading and fraudulent trading and all that sketchy stuff that he himself was doing back in the 1920s. He takes a very hard line against deception, and they draft several regulations that are still in effect to this very day. And in doing so, he completely reforms the industry, and he convinces the American public to once again reinvest into the stock market and grow their wealth in a safer way. And to be honest, he does such a great job at this. By 1935, he resigns as chairman. The next year, during that political cycle, he writes a book as to why he's supporting FDR and the New Deal, while also doing the usual fundraising and all that billionaire influence stuff. Gets him reelected again, and in response to this, in 1937, he's made the chairman of U.S. Maritime Commission, due to his experiences working in that naval yard back during World War I. Of course, he would have some stumbling blocks, so in 1938, he was appointed as ambassador to the United Kingdom. And as the election cycle in 1940 was coming up, he was kind of convinced that Roosevelt wasn't going to get the Democratic nomination for the presidency. He was quoted as stating that he thought Roosevelt was going to fall in 1940, and this alluded to his own presidential aspirations, where he thought that he may succeed FDR. And he was confident in this, however, he was wrong. Of course, he damages his own reputation even further during World War II and the Battle of Britain. So while the Luftwaffe were beginning their bombardment of the British Isles, particularly London, Kennedy and his family, they leave London and they retreat to the countryside, and this really damages his reputation with the British. Even the son of Winston Churchill, Randolph, he was quoted as saying, "I thought my daffodils were yellow until I met Joe Kennedy." And Kennedy starts to gain the reputation as a coward and a defeatist. However, there were other factors which were going into this. Kennedy at the time preferred a policy of neutrality and appeasement to Nazi demands. He thought that the Germans were going to overrun Europe and possibly the British Isles, so he thought the best solution was a diplomatic one, where all sides win, but not really. And a couple of times, without the approval of the Department of State, he sought out meetings with our little mustachioed dictator in order to establish peaceful relations, which naturally would piss off the British. At the time, he was supporting American neutrality and isolationism, and his anti-Semitic views wasn't helping him very much. Now, when news of a bunch of his quotes that were being quoted in British media made it back to the White House, he was recalled from his position as U.S. ambassador to the UK. Despite this, he was still very popular and influential and wealthy, and Roosevelt was running for an unprecedented third term, and he needed Kennedy's support. So eventually Kennedy does throw his support behind Roosevelt by whipping up Irish Catholic support mostly. But their relationship is very strained at this point because Kennedy, he believed that Roosevelt getting a third term meant that the Americans would be at war with Germany, which was something he really didn't believe in. He did not want to go to war with Germany. He wanted to find some kind of neutral, peaceful solution. To be perfectly blunt, a lot of people think he was kind of a closet Nazi, but we'll never really know. I think he was just an isolationist. After Roosevelt wins his election, he submits his resignation as the ambassador to the UK. And he spends most of World War II kind of on the sidelines outside of national politics, mostly focused on more local venues, dealing with like Irish Catholics and stuff like that. He does, in that election cycle of 1944, in these smaller venues, rallies American Irish Catholics again to vote for Roosevelt in 1944. And by then, he claims that he's eager to help with the war effort, but due to his previous gaffes, nobody really trusts him at this point. So the 1940s were a pretty difficult time for old Joseph Kennedy. But Joseph Kennedy never loses that ambition for his sons to succeed in business and wealth and especially politics. He spends most of his adult life building alliances with political factions and political leaders in order to build a network of supporters which would launch his own children into American political prominence. And a lot of these men that he built these alliances with would be prominent political figures of the latter half of the 20th century. In 1947, he supported a young and upcoming figure that we know today as Richard Nixon in his bid to Congress. More about Nixon in a future episode. He also threw his support behind Joseph McCartney, who we all know for his harsh anti-communist stance. However, the third and fourth Roosevelt terms and World War II just proved to himself and America that he would never be president. So he really focuses on young John, who at the time had participated directly in World War II. But I'll get to that in a little bit. His power and influence would launch John F. Kennedy to presidential status. So let's go into the topic of the day, the myth, the legend, John F. Kennedy. Now, John F. Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917 in Brooklyn, Massachusetts, and he was the second of 9 children. Joseph Jr. being the elder brother, he would later die during World War II. And naturally, with Kennedy being the younger brother, his father's focus for him being president wasn't there. That focus was shifted to his older brother, Joseph Jr. And when Joseph Jr. was a young man, he had aspired to run for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives after his military service. However, he was tragically killed while participating in Operation Aphrodite in 1944, which causes his father to shift those political aspirations to young John. So let's go to John F. Kennedy's youth. So to say that he lived a luxurious, privileged lifestyle is an understatement. By the time Jack is born, he is born into generational wealth. If he wanted to, he could have literally just lived a quiet life just off of his trust fund. But his father had great ambitions for all of his children, and he encouraged them to be ambitious. He emphasized political discussions at the dinner table, and he demanded a high level of academic achievement for his children. And throughout the 20s and early 30s, they're living that millionaire lifestyle. They would spend their summers on Cape Cod, where they would swim and sail and play touch football. And Christmas, during that time of the year, they would spend it down in Palm Beach at their winter retreat. Because due to his father's machinations, the Depression actually increased the family fortune. They didn't suffer during the Depression at all. However, they do end up moving from Boston in 1927. A lot of people believed it was in part due to a polio outbreak in Massachusetts at the time. And we got to remember, this is the 1920s, so there's no polio vaccine at the time, and this was still a disease that could kill. But the popular story comes from Robert F. Kennedy, who told Look magazine at one point that they left Boston because of job signs that read, "No Irish need apply." And we have to remember, this was a time when the Irish, especially Irish Catholics, were still looked down upon, especially in New England. A lot of Irish Catholics during this time were viewed by other Americans as not being fully American because they swore allegiance to a pope in Rome. And of course, all the negative Irish stereotypes would go with it, the drunkenness, the violence, insert stereotype here. So I could see how a little bit of that might have influenced their decision to depart Boston. But I think for the most part, it was due to this polio outbreak and the fact that they had kind of outgrew Boston. They no longer were big fish in a small pond playing politics on a local scale. They were riding high with aspirations towards the federal level of government. So Jack and his siblings, they would end up going to private schools. He himself at 13 went to the Canterbury School, and then after that he went to Choate. These are still to this day very elite preparatory schools. He graduated from this school in June of 1935, and he finished 64 in his class of 112 students. Now, throughout Jack's entire childhood, he did suffer from ill health. It was ill health that caused him to transfer schools early in his youth. In 1935, he intended to study at the London School of Economics as his older brother had done, but ill health forced him to return to the United States. In October of 1935, he enrolls into Princeton, but due to a gastrointestinal illness, he's forced to leave that college after only 2 months. After this, in September 1936, he enrolled in Harvard, and he focused mostly on athletics while at Harvard. And it was here, while playing football on the JV squad during his sophomore year, where he sustains a back injury that basically messes him up for the rest of his life. And to be honest, Kennedy would suffer from health problems his entire life. But in 1938, he's with his family when his father is ambassador to the United Kingdom, and he's there during the outbreak of World War II. And leading up to this, he had traveled with his family all over Europe and into the Soviet Union and blah, blah, blah. And unlike his father, he actually took a very harsh stance against the rise of fascist Germany at the time. And this hard stance really comes out in his thesis that he wrote for his senior year. It was entitled Appeasement in Munich, and it was about British negotiations during the Munich Agreement. And this thesis in 1940 was released as a book under the title Why England Slept. And this really dives into the political situation at the time, and it addresses Britain's unwillingness to strengthen its military in the lead up to the war. And at the time, the book called for an Anglo-American alliance, which would oppose rising totalitarian powers. And to be honest, this book was a bestseller. It gave deep insight into Britain's response leading up to World War II. And in 1940, Jack, he graduates from Harvard with a Bachelor's of Arts in Government, concentrating on international affairs. And that fall, he enrolled in the Stanford Graduate School of Business and audited classes. However, he didn't stay very long. He left shortly after to help his father compile his memoirs as an American ambassador. He briefly thinks about attending Yale Law School, but he cancels because of America's involvement in World War II. And young Jack is like, I'm gonna go serve my nation. However, there's just one problem. Jack is riddled with health issues, particularly this bad back which he sustained from that football injury. So after this, and after months of training, Jack decides that he wants to enter the Army's Officer Candidate School. And if I recall, the civilian way to enter that school is you have to be a college graduate, go through their OCS program, and go through basic training. I could be wrong on that, but I think that's how it works. However, due to these chronic back problems, he was medically disqualified. But Jack, he doesn't take that laying down. He's like, wow, fuck this, I'm Jack Kennedy. I'm gonna get into the military one way or the other. So with Jack being a man of privilege with a lot of friends and allies in the federal government, he pulls some strings, maybe calls in some favors, and on September 24th, 1941, Kennedy, with the help of the director of the Office of Naval Intelligence, who was also the former naval attaché to his father, allows him to join the Naval Reserves as an ensign. And for the first several months, he's basically stuck in a office gig or like stuck behind a desk. But his ambition at the time was to become the commander of a PT boat. However, once again, his health got in the way, so his father actually helped fake some medical documents, as well as convincing the officers in this PT boat program that given their clout in the political world, that this would be good PR for their squadron or their program. So the officers acquiesce, and Kennedy, he does his training in this squadron, and he's given his first command, Patrol Torpedo Boat 101. That lasted from December 7th of 1942 until February 23rd of 1943. And he was sent to patrol the Panama Canal. So he's essentially once again sidelined. And this pretty much pisses Jack off. He appeals to his buddy, who was a Massachusetts senator named David Walsh, who arranged for him to finally be assigned to the South Pacific, which is what he was desiring. He really wanted to see action at this point. And to be honest, I kind of get it. He's a young man of privilege, but he also wants to prove himself in the world. I guess he wants to show himself in the world that he's not just some soft little privileged Nancy boy who's going to spend the entire war behind a desk, especially when his brother is also seeing active duty in this war. So in April 1943, Jack finally gets his wish, and he was assigned to Motor Torpedo Squadron 2. And on the 24th of April, he took command of PT-109, the ship he would become famous for. And this is all based in the Solomon Islands, and they're basically on like anti-Japanese patrol. But it was on the night of August 1st through August 2nd, which PT-109 and Jack Kennedy would go down in history. So on this night, PT-109 and 14 other PTs were ordered to block or repel 4 Japanese destroyers and float planes carrying food, supplies, and 900 Japanese soldiers en route to the Villa Plantation garrison on the southern tip of the Solomons Colombaranga Island. So on this moonless night at about 2 a.m., Kennedy spotted the silhouette of a Japanese destroyer returning from that island. As he attempted to turn the boat to attack, the destroyer hit him at an angle and sheared the boat right in half. It killed 2 men instantly, injured various others, including Jack, who re-injured his back at the time, and they all dove into the water and was clinging on to this now burning wreckage of this boat. Now, this whole incident happens 3.5 miles off of what's now called Plum Pudding Island, also now known as Kennedy's Island, which is this uninhabited little spit of land out there in the Solomons. And they realize that they just have to swim for it, and one guy, he's so injured he can't swim, so Kennedy literally has this guy's life jacket in his teeth, and himself with a back injury, along with this crew and this guy he's dragging with his teeth, all make this 3-mile swim towards this little speck of uninhabited land. So they all make it to this little speck of land, and Jack, alongside his ensign, a man named George Ross, start making their way to the other islands kind of around them in order to get word to anybody that they're alive and they need rescued. Eventually, on these islands, they do encounter an English-speaking native who had been working with the U.S. Navy at the time as a scout, and Jack carves his location on a coconut husk and requests a boat rescue. 7 days after they land on that little spit of an island, they are rescued, and this became a highly publicized affair. And later in life, when he decides to enter politics, this story follows him. It gives him a foundation as a leader, as a hero, as someone with a strong will and strong courage. And rightly so, because of these actions, he was a war hero. He was awarded for this the Navy and Marine Corps Medal and the Purple Heart due to this further back injury that happened when he was on PT-109. But that wasn't the end of his military career, so after months of recovery, Jack returned to duty commanding the PT-59, where he and 2 other PT boats participated in the rescue of 40 to 50 Marines, while under heavy fire from the Japanese. PT-59 essentially acted as a shield during this mission. However, this would be the great last hurrah for Kennedy during the war because he would spend the remainder of the war relieved of his command per doctor's orders. He would spend much of the next 2 years in and out of hospitals for these back injuries. On March 1st, 1945, he was retired and honorably discharged with the full rank of lieutenant, and the reason for that discharge was physical disability. Now, unfortunately for the Kennedys, the older brother, kind of the heir to the throne, Joe Jr., he was tragically shot down, and his body was never recovered, which after this event, their father would shift his presidential aspirations onto Jack. And the first step in this process was to keep Jack's name in the public eye, and he did this through his buddy William Randolph Hearst. Everybody knows him as the famous newspaper magnate. William Randolph Hearst gives Kennedy a position as a newspaper correspondent or a reporter. This exposes him to the world of journalism, and it keeps Kennedy's name in the public eye, because the next step is Congress. So while Jack's doing this journalism thing, his father Joe is laying the foundations for a congressional run. Jack is originally slated to be on the ballot as a lieutenant governor for the state of Massachusetts in an upcoming election, but Joseph decides to get him into the House of Representatives instead, because that would give him a national presence as opposed to just a state presence. But the thing is, at the time, that coveted seat is already occupied by a U.S. representative named James Michael Curley. So old Joe, he goes to Representative Curley and he offers him a deal. He says, vacate your congressional seat, and I'll guarantee that you will become the mayor of Boston in 1946, an office which he had held 3 different times in the past. And if you really look into the history of that guy, it's very fascinating with his history with politics, but I digress. So Joe, knowing how this works, he calls his son and he says, "Hey Jack, establish legal residency in Massachusetts so we can get you this 11th congressional seat." And with his father basically funding and running this whole campaign, Kennedy wins the Democratic primary, beating out 9 other candidates with 42% of the vote, and he wins the runoff election, defeating the Republican with 72% of the vote. Now, young Jack, he would spend 6 years in the House of Representatives. For those who don't know, that's 3 terms. And he was probably more disinterested in this position than anybody ever. If I recall, I think he set a record for absenteeism. However, a lot of that was due to health concerns. But he was very disinterested in the day-to-day runnings of the House. He found his fellow politicians boring and more concerned with their narrow political views than anything else. He didn't care for what he considered to be these arcane House rules and customs, which slowed the whole process of creating law. And to be honest, I think the only reason why he served 3 terms in the first place was due to his father's urging. However, he did serve on the Education Labor Committee and the Veterans Affairs Committee. He supported the Truman Doctrine. However, in 1949, he does denounce Truman and the State Department, as he sees that they were largely responsible for what he saw as the fall of China. So this was when the Chinese communists rose to power. And while not taking as hard as a stance as like McCartney at the time against the rise of communism, he does support hemming in of communism. He doesn't want to see communism spread. So to appeal to Italian Americans, he backs basically what is known as Operation Gladio, which I really need to do an episode on, which was this quasi-CIA U.S. Army intelligence operation to stem the rise of communism in Italy. But it turned into this like crypto-fascist shit show because it starred Alan Dulles and a bunch of former Nazis going on like assassination missions, which would then be blamed on the communists, and it actually influenced several elections in Italy. But I digress. But in 1949, Kennedy would start setting his sights on the U.S. Senate. He briefly entertains the idea of running for the governor of Massachusetts, but he decides he'd rather be in the Senate in order to stay on that national stage. And in 1952, he runs against the 3-term Republican incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., and his little brother Robert would emerge as his campaign manager. His father naturally financed the whole thing and probably bribed a few people. And this was a close race. Kennedy won by only 70,000 votes. It was during this election cycle when he would meet his future wife, Jacqueline Bouvier. If I recall, they met at a dinner party and they just instantly hit it off, and shortly after he was nominated to the Senate. And the next year, in 1953, they were married. He was 36 and she was 24 at the time. So they married on September 12, 1953 at St. Mary's Church in Newport, Rhode Island. And with these 2 people being wealthy socialites, it was considered the social event of the season. It had over 700 guests and over 1,200 attended the reception, which is insane when you think of those numbers. I think during my wedding, it was like 40 or 50 people. And to be honest, despite everything, despite being basically billionaire American royalty, they did have a lot of personal setbacks in the early years of their marriage, which would also attribute to Jack's high absenteeism rates in the Senate. So in 1954, he had these series of spinal surgeries, which nearly killed him. In 1955, she suffered a miscarriage, and in 1956, that pregnancy ended up being a stillborn. So they had a bit of a rough start, but all in all, Jack Kennedy, he's still a senator, and he actually becomes a very popular senator. He really doubles down on his promises to do more for the state of Massachusetts, which he does. For example, he comes out with this 36-point plan in order to improve the local economy of the state of Massachusetts, and that focused on things like fishing and textile manufacturing and watchmaking and shipbuilding. He proposes tax incentives to companies who remain within the state boundaries and don't leave to some other state or some other country. And these proposals do help stimulate the economy of the area. They were largely successful. And in fact, he's such a success in the Senate that he's reelected in 1958. However, by then he already has his sights set on the White House for the 1960 election. And that's one of the most famous elections in U.S. history. It's the Kennedy-Nixon election. This election was the first time we would see televised live debates, and Kennedy, understanding media, was really able to use television to his advantage. That's why everybody who watches that debate will clearly tell you that Kennedy won. However, he almost didn't even get the nomination because this is at a time where there is a split in the Democratic Party. The old school Southern Democrats didn't really dig Kennedy's New England policies. That's precisely why he chooses Johnson as his running mate. It's his way of securing that Southern vote at the time. Now, this was a very tight race. It was one of the closest races in American history. Old Jack, he just barely beats out Nixon by 0.2%. It was 49.7 to 49.5. However, Kennedy does sweep up in the Electoral College. During that time, 269 votes were needed to win. Kennedy receives 303 votes to Nixon's 219, and 14 electors from Mississippi, Alabama, and one from Oklahoma refused to support Kennedy because of his pro-stance on the civil rights movement, and they cast their electoral ballots to Senator Harry F. Byrd of Virginia. They were basically like protest ballots, but that wasn't quite enough to cost Kennedy the election. So at 43 years old, John F. Kennedy is the youngest person ever elected to the presidency. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was only 42 when he ascended the presidency. However, he wasn't elected during his first term. He got that because McKinley was assassinated. Which reminds me, I still have to do that episode about Theodore Roosevelt because not only was he the greatest American president of all time, the dude is a total, outright, badass legend. Like, somebody really needs to do like a hardcore comic book series or graphic novel series or just a series of films about that dude's life because it was insane. But back to Kennedy. So I'm not going to dive into every policy he was involved with during his presidency. I'm just going to skim over the basics. But his presidency was really dominated by three things. One, the Soviet Union and the Cold War, especially when it pertains to Cuba directly after their revolution. Cuba becomes a major thorn in Kennedy's side throughout his presidency. Two, the civil rights movement in America. This was at the peak of it. And three, his New Frontier policy, which would go on to include things like the formulation of NASA. And in this policy, it was a domestic one where he really wanted to do things like fund underprivileged people in places like Appalachia. He looked into things like medical insurance for the elderly and raising the minimum wage, and looked at plans which would provide funding for things like urban redevelopment and stuff like that. And there would be other major events that would impact his presidency, so the space race, the building of the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, decolonization in Africa, which he paid great attention to because he feared that communism would spread to these new regions. So he created things like the Peace Corps to go in and kind of keep that from happening. And most of his policies are focused on just stopping the spread of communism in the world. That's kind of the core of most of these policies. However, he's not without his criticisms, so on the domestic front, when it came to the civil rights movement, he was slow to react. And this wasn't because he didn't support the civil rights movement, he did. It was largely because there was this split in the Democratic Party, and he still needed that strong Southern Democratic support in order to have other bills and laws passed in the legislature. So he had to appease these Southern Democrats in order to get some of his policies approved. Now, there were times when Kennedy did directly intervene in some of these incidents, but it was really the most extreme ones that were making national news when he actually got up and did anything. But sadly, that is the nature of politics in this country. If you want to get anything done, sometimes you have to appease evil. But luckily, we do have people who know where the line is. So even that little glossed over segment of some of what was going on during Kennedy's presidency, that alone really shows that this wasn't Camelot, as a lot of people say it is. That idea comes from nostalgia for the time, and it mostly comes from people who didn't live during that time. This was a very chaotic and scary time in America. We gotta remember that the Soviet Union is coming onto the stage as a world power, and this is the peak of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis kicks off, the Bay of Pigs kicks off. There was this real fear that communism was gonna swallow up the world, and America and parts of Europe would be the last ones standing. This was a time when people were building bomb shelters in their basements, and men and women were being lynched and abused and beaten and jailed and all this other stuff in the South, simply because some backwards thinking racist dickbags didn't want to drag their asses out of the 19th century. But this was also a time of NASA and scientific advancement. It was kind of that tail end of the golden age of America post-World War II. And to be honest, I can see why a lot of people who are around, especially children who were around at that time, who remember that time, who are now the baby boomer generation today, I can see why they idolize that as Camelot. It's a nostalgia thing. It's the exact same reason why my generation is so obsessed with the 90s and our childhoods. That era between the collapse of the Soviet Union and 9/11 is seen as a golden age in our eyes because things were just different. But I think now during this digression, I'm going to move a little bit away from his presidential policies and let's talk about what's going on in the man's life at this time, because this is where all the goss comes from. So at this time, Jack Kennedy, he was on a series of different drugs. And this is all well documented. Now, a lot of people say it was methamphetamine. It wasn't technically methamphetamine, but he was given amphetamines. And he was given this whole cocktail mix of drugs just to kind of ease his pain during all these health problems he was having. And it's crazy to think that the leader of the free world is doped up on a cocktail of like painkillers and stuff. But in reality, that is a lot more common than you think it is. And it is true, it has been documented that some of the side effects from these medications may have changed world policy. One of the side effects was that he would become irritable or short-tempered, and this may have happened during that infamous first meeting with Khrushchev. And speaking of Soviet policy at the time, it is true that the CIA was interfering a lot in the Kennedy administration, especially when it comes to Cuba. The Bay of Pigs incident was basically a CIA organized shit show that resulted in just souring relations with Cuba even further. And to be honest, it essentially forced them into the arms of the Soviet Union. However, a more successful campaign, a CIA campaign that Kennedy authorized that gets a little bit overlooked, is Operation Mongoose. And it was a series of CIA operations and assassination attempts on Castro himself, and that turns into a big CIA shit show as well. But I discussed that back in that bonus episode about CIA hijinks. Go check it out. Of course, Kennedy did wisely reject Operation Northwoods, which was hardcore insane. Essentially, the CIA were going to carry out a series of false flag terrorist attacks against United States citizens, blaming the Cubans in order to spark a war with Cuba. And this just shows how much power and influence and how crazy the CIA was back in the early 60s. 60s. And it makes you wonder how insane they are today. But I will say, rejecting Operation Northwoods was probably one of Kennedy's more level-headed moments. And speaking of head, pun totally intended, let's get on to some of his alleged affairs. So even as far back as Kennedy's early political career, he was a bit of a poonhound. There were at least 6 women he was known to have affairs with, and the rumors would go that anywhere he went, there was always 2, let's just be honest, hookers with him, whom the Secret Service would infamously name Frick and Frack. Now, whether or not the hooker thing is true, that's anybody's guess. Probably was. But we do know of at least 6 women whom he did have an affair with. One was Mimi Alford. She was an intern at the White House between 1962 and 1963. It was alleged that they had an affair during this time. The infamous Marlene Dietrich, who had affairs with several celebrities and movie stars throughout her life. In her 50s, it was said that she had affairs with both Joe and John Kennedy. And her life is extremely fascinating. If you ever get a chance to read a biography about her, I suggest you do. Judith Exner was also an alleged mistress of Jack back when he was a senator. Mary Pinchot Meyer, she was a long-term associate and lover of Kennedy. They actually had an affair when he was in the White House. Gunilla von Post allegedly had an affair with him when he was still a senator in the 50s. And Pamela Turner, who was the press secretary to Jacqueline Kennedy, also alleged to have an affair. But the most infamous one is what we're all waiting for, Marilyn Monroe. And that is the $100,000 question. Did Jack Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe knock boots? Well, to be honest, all signs point to no. However, there was one incident where it could have possibly happened. So Marilyn Monroe and John F. Kennedy did spend a weekend together in March of 1962 while they were both staying at Bing Crosby's house. Also, people who manned the White House switchboard had noted in 1962 that Marilyn had called the White House. Now, on the surface, most people would say, okay, that's nothing. It was probably a platonic friendship, which does exist between men and women, despite what everybody thinks. But this was fucking Jack Kennedy. So I guess unless you went back in time and installed a camera in that house, we wouldn't know. But despite all this, and even head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, having extensive files on Kennedy and his affairs and liaisons and all that stuff, Jackie still loved him. It never became like the infamous Clinton situation. But I guess it was just different back then. The reporters and the people in the know, they really tried hard to keep that stuff out of the public eye. Nobody wanted to hear that their president was having extramarital affairs. And to be honest, those who did knew probably didn't really care. Except maybe J. Edgar Hoover. I mean, that guy had files on literally anybody who was in politics during his whole reign as head of the FBI. Of course, he did this to maintain power, but I digress. I should really do an episode on Hoover and the FBI. So at this point, I think we've dispelled all the myths. All there is the Ich bin ein Berliner. He actually did say that, so that's not a myth, but this part of his life is really what entangles him to his assassin. Because of his hard stance on communism and his hard stance on Cuba, he naturally gained the ire of Lee Harvey Oswald. And now we get to listen to a biography about his life. However, Oswald was only 24, so it's not a very long biography. But as we know, the reason why I do this is so we can get right into the mindset of these people. Because for the rest of this, we're going to focus on his assassination, his death, and the conspiracies around it, because there are tons of them. So crack open another beer, get comfortable, grab your favorite death bunny, because this is where our story truly starts. And it starts on October 18th, 1939 in New Orleans, Louisiana. On that day, Lee Harvey Oswald is born. Mazel tov, or whatever. He wasn't Jewish, but, you know, that's what they say when kids are born and have their breasts and stuff. I digress. Voodoo Ranger number 2, by the way. I absolutely love this stuff. It is my favorite IPA of all time at this point. So, Lee Harvey Oswald. We get to use 3 names because all the presidential assassins always get 3 names for some reason. He's born in the Old French Hospital in New Orleans to Robert Edward Lee Oswald Sr., who was a MetLife worker, and his mother, Marguerite Frances Clavier, who worked as a legal clerk. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald never met his father because Robert had died 2 months before he was born of a heart attack. And with his mother basically raising 2 kids, he had an older brother who was a Marine, and working full time, it caused a lot of instability in his youth. And Lee had shown from an early age that he had some mental issues, as well as a learning disability. Now, the learning disability was basically, for lack of a better term, dyslexia. He was a voracious reader. However, he couldn't spell. He would do very low on tests when it came to spelling. And if you're wondering how somebody can be a voracious reader, however they can't spell, well, reading and spelling are 2 different skills. And in the case of something like English, where we only have 26 characters and our brains are kind of lazy, we don't sit and discern every character of a word when we read it. But I digress. Now, in the 4th grade, Oswald did take an IQ test where he scored 103, which is kind of like high average. And he did score very proficient on reading tests. However, he was always the worst on spelling tests. Of course, even at this young age, he had attended several different schools in kind of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. His mother, not really having a sense of stability, would move around a lot. By the time he's 12, they had bounced to New York. And this is where we really start to see some psychological issues pop up in young Lee. So several people who knew him at this time described him as withdrawn and temperamental. And he would have outbursts of violence. While staying in New York at the age of 12, there was an incident where young Lee had struck his mother and he threatened the lady of the house at the time, I guess his half-aunt or whatever, with a knife. And they were promptly asked to leave after this incident. Also at this time, Oswald was frequently truant from the 7th grade, and when the truant officers got involved, this all led to a psychological assessment at a juvenile reformatory. The reformatory psychiatrist at the time, a Dr. Renatus Hartogs, described Oswald as, quote, immersed in a vivid fantasy life, turning around the topics of omnipotence and power through which he tries to compensate for his present shortcomings and frustrations. And his diagnosis was, quote, personality pattern disturbance with schizoid features and passive-aggressive tendencies, end quote. At the end of the day, he was described as an emotionally quite disturbed youngster who suffers under the impact of really existing emotional isolation and deprivation, lack of affection, absence of family life, and a rejection by a self-involved and conflicted mother. So the young preteen Lee Oswald was a little bit screwed up in the head at this point, with no father, no stability, and literally no affection from his mother, who was described as self-involved, which just boils down to general neglect. And this would be reiterated by other counselors who would come to the same conclusion that due to his mother's neglect, that he was exhibiting these behaviors as kind of a protective shell against the world rejecting him. However, before he could really get any help that he needs, his mother decides to drag him back to Texas, where his disciplinary problems continue in school. He remains truant. By the age of 17, he had been in like 12 different schools, resided in 22 different locations, and at this point in his life, he was really yearning for some kind of purpose, so he decides at 17 to drop out of school and just join the Marines. And he mostly does this because his older brother had joined the Marines and he found success and stability there. And to be honest, I don't care what side of the political spectrum you're on or what you think of military service, but military service has saved the lives of many people who really had nowhere to turn, who had no stability in life. I would encourage any young man or woman who is looking for that sense of direction in life to at least join the military, any branch, for at least one contract. It really does change lives. For the most part. However, even by this time, he was already a devout socialist. He did not believe in capitalism because he was a voracious reader and he had a very deep interest in socialism. Even at the age of 16, he had wrote to the Socialist Party of America for information on their Young People's Socialist League, saying that he had been studying these socialist principles for over 15 months by this time. But despite those largely economic beliefs, he still joins the Marine Corps. He was able to enlist a week after his 17th birthday, but because of his age, his older brother Robert was required to sign as his legal guardian. And that first year or so in the Marines, he's doing very well. He trains as a radar operator, and he actually is granted a security clearance, which allows him to handle confidential documents. That's like the second highest level, right below secret. And he's doing very well. He goes to Kessler Air Force Base in Mississippi and finished 7th in a class of 30 in the Aircraft Control and Warning Operator course. And he's given the MOS of Aviation Electronics Operator. And for those wondering, I think in the Marines at that time it was Victor 22, but I digress. After this, he's stationed at the Marine Corps Air Station El Toro in California, where he met a fellow Marine by the name of Kerry Thornley. Now, some people might know him as the co-creator of Discordianism, which is kind of one of those joke religions. And it's stated that Thornley's 1962 fictional book, The Idle Warriors, was based on Oswald himself. Now, whether that's true or whether or not he just attached that after the assassination, we'll never know. But that's kind of the official story. After this, he was stationed to Japan, to the Marine Air Control Squadron 1 at the Naval Air Facility in Atsugi near Tokyo. And infamously, this comes up every time anybody talks about Lee Harvey Oswald's military career. He did qualify as a sharpshooter, just barely. And a couple of years later, when he requalified as a marksman. So he was an okay shot at best, which will obviously come up later. However, he does start to get in trouble with the Marines. So at one point he's court-martialed because he accidentally shoots himself in the elbow with a .22 pistol, which he was not authorized to carry. And that is one thing a lot of people outside the military world, I guess, don't understand. You can't just carry like any weapon you want. Depending on your MOS and other certain factors, there are weapons that you're authorized to use, and there are weapons that you're not authorized to use, or in some cases, even keep. And Lee Harvey Oswald was not authorized to be in possession of this .22 pistol, so he is court-martialed for it. But then it gets worse for him because after this incident, he's court-martialed a second time for fighting with the sergeant whom he thought was responsible for his punishment in the shooting matter. And after this court-martial, he's demoted from PFC, Private First Class, to Private, and briefly imprisoned. He then gets in trouble a third time while he's on this night watch in the Philippines, and for some unexplained reason, he fires his rifle into the jungle. Now, he wasn't court-martialed or anything, but I believe he was severely disciplined enough for it to make it into the historical record. Of course, while he's in the Marines, he does teach himself rudimentary Russian. Now, he does test in this and tests very poorly. And it said that throughout the rest of his life, his Russian was very poor. And he's most likely doing this because even during his time as the Marines, he espouses a lot of pro-Soviet propaganda. He's kind of obsessed with it. He's basically a young 20-something political radical at this point. Which, to be honest, what young 20-something isn't a political radical? And to be honest, I'm almost 40, and people consider me a political radical because I'm an anarchist, but whatever. So in 1958, Oswald is sent back to El Toro, where he was basically sent to train newly enlisted men and officers for these later assignments in this kind of radar MOS, and he does a pretty good job at this. An officer who was training at the time with him stated that he was a very competent crew chief and was brighter than most people. However, this was during the very end of his military career, so on September 11th, 1959, he's granted a hardship discharge. Now, hardship discharges are usually family-related. They're usually early releases, which are given out for service members who face extreme personal or financial hardships that prevent them from fulfilling their duties. So at this time, Oswald claimed that his mother was very ill and he needed to take care of her and was granted a hardship discharge. However, he was required to fulfill the remainder of his contract in the Marine Reserves. However, this was probably a cover for him to defect to the Soviet Union, because at this point he had made the decision to defect. So at this point he's taught himself very rudimentary Russian, and he saved about $1,500 of his salary, which is the equivalent to about $13,000 today, in order to travel to the Soviet Union. He only spends 2 days with his mother in Fort Worth before he departs on September 20th to New Orleans, and then on to France. After which he arrives in Southampton, UK on October 9th. He told officials at the time that he had $700 and planned to stay for 1 week before proceeding to a school in Switzerland. And on that same day, he flew to Helsinki, where he checked in at the Hotel Torny, room 309, and then moved to the Hotel Klaus, Kuki, where he stayed in room 429. He was then issued a Soviet tourist visa, which was only good for a week, and he arrives in Moscow on October 16th. And even during this time, his mail was being intercepted and read by the CIA, who were keeping tabs on basically anybody who was going into the Soviet Union at the time. Remember, this is the peak of the Cold War. They were really looking for spies and defectors and double agents. So an American citizen traveling to the Soviet Union, even on a 1-week tourist visa, that's a red flag. However, Oswald wasn't just accepted with open arms into the Soviet Union. It doesn't work that way. So basically what happens is he tells his tour guide that he has a desire to become a Soviet citizen, and somehow that gets him in front of a bunch of Soviet officials, and they say that this guy's crazy, these ideas are incomprehensible, why do you want to defect and become a Soviet citizen? Doesn't make any sense. And we gotta remember, these are Soviet officials who were thinking this. They're just thinking he's just some crazy American with high hopes and dreams of communism. And they flat out reject his citizenship application at first, and when his tourist visa expires, they're ready to deport his ass back into non-communist Europe. And in order to delay his departure and I guess show the Soviets that he was serious, on the day his tourist visa expires, October 21st, he slashes his left wrist and he's forced to go to the hospital. And the Soviets, now thinking they have a crazy guy on their hands, they keep him in the hospital for an additional week under psychiatric care. So after a week in this hospital, 4 more Soviet officials meet with him and they asked if he wanted to return to the United States. And he replied by insisting that he wanted to live in the Soviet Union as a Soviet national. And at this point, he produces to these Soviet officials his Marine Corps discharge papers. After this, on October 31st, Halloween, he shows up at the American Embassy in Moscow and declares a desire to renounce his U.S. citizenship. He also, during this interview with this U.S. Embassy official, boasts that he had planned to basically give all the knowledge that he had learned about radar systems in the Marine Corps to the Soviet Union upon their request. And when news of this gets back to the Marine Corps, they change his hardship/honorable military discharge to undesirable, which is basically a Section 8, or in modern terms, I think it's still a Chapter 13. Basically, it means you're a crazy guy. Of course, there's other little nuances to it. Sometimes it means you failed to adapt to military lifestyle. Sometimes it means that you just didn't really make it in basic training, etc., etc. But at this point, the Marine Corps has pretty much washed their hands of Lee Harvey Oswald. But eventually, the Soviets and the U.S. State Department agreed to allow him to defect to the Soviet Union. Now, at this time, Oswald has his heart set on attending Moscow State University, but in January 1960, he was sent to Minsk in Belarus. He was sent to work as a lathe operator at Gorzont Electronics Factory This factory produced radios and televisions and military and space equipment, basically just a general catch-all for electronics. However, at this job, he would actually meet and spend a lot of time with Belarus's first independent head of state post the collapse of the Soviet Union, a man named Stanislaw Sheshkevich. And he was actually assigned the task of teaching Oswald Russian. And at this time, Oswald, he's living a pretty stable life. He's given a studio apartment, which was fully subsidized by the government. It was fully furnished. Being an American defector, he had some technical knowledge about radar systems that the Soviets probably wanted, so it added an additional boost to his pay. And he was living a pretty comfortable Soviet lifestyle for the time. However, he was under constant surveillance by the KGB and possibly the US State Department. Because at this time, it's like, who knows, maybe he's a double agent pretending to be a crazy guy. And at this same time, Oswald, he meets this Belarusian woman and they date for a while. He proposes to her, but she refuses. Mostly because she finds out he was seeing other women, but the dude's like 20 years old, so what do you expect? However, by January of 1961, Oswald has had enough of the Soviet Union. He has realized that Khrushchev's Soviet Union wasn't the workers' paradise that he thought it was. In a diary entry in January 1961, he writes, quote, "I am starting to reconsider my desire about staying. The work is drab, the money I get is nowhere to be spent, no nightclubs or bowling alleys, no places of recreation except the trade union dances. I have had enough." End quote. He's starting to realize that the good old US of A wasn't all that terrible. And to be honest, I think a lot of people end up having that kind of regret when they leave the good old USA, when they're like expats, especially if they go to like a third world country. They start to realize that some of the stuff they took for granted here isn't available in their new country, and they get those regrets. Now, that's not true of everybody. I mean, a lot of people who are expats to places like Europe don't really experience that because Western Europe is highly developed just like the US. But I will just say that some nations aren't as highly developed. And to be honest, culturally speaking, sometimes it's just hard for Americans to assimilate fully. Because we are an extremely unique culture. I mean, that's why half the world thinks we're fucking crazy, but I digress. So Oswald, realizing that he never formally renounced his United States citizenship, contacts the US Embassy in Moscow and requests his passport back. And given that it's bureaucracy, it takes several weeks for this to do. But within that several weeks, Oswald would meet his wife, a 19-year-old pharmacology student named Marina Persakova. They marry within 6 weeks of meeting each other. They then go on to have a child named June, who was born on February 15th, 1962. And that May, Oswald and Marina applied at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow for documents that enabled her to immigrate to the U.S. And by June 13, they had arrived back in the United States. And shortly after, they moved to the Dallas-Fort Worth area where Oswald's mother and brother lived. And even though Dallas-Fort Worth is Oswald's home, and Oswald's an American, they do become acquainted with the Russian immigrant community in this area. And a lot of these people were anti-communists, and they didn't really care for Lee. They found him arrogant and rude, because even at this point, he hadn't renounced communism. He basically wanted to be a communist, but still live in the United States and appreciate all the things the United States has to offer. And at this time, Oswald, he's not really holding a steady job. He works for a while as a sheet metal worker, but he finds the work dull and he quits. He then gets a job as a photo print trainee, but he only lasts about a week on this job because of his rudeness and his proclivity to fight. So they quickly realize, we gotta fire this dude. Then in April 1963, he gets a job in New Orleans as a machinery greaser. He got fired from that job because he would spend most of his day just lounging around at the garage next door where he would read newspapers and hunting magazines all day. So he's really just kind of drifting aimlessly at this point. He doesn't really seem to have any direction in life. Of course, in early 1963, this is the time when Oswald purchases by mail a .38 Smith & Wesson Model 10 revolver and a second-hand 6.5mm caliber Carcano rifle. And these would be the weapons that would come into play later this year. Now, he purchases these firearms under an alias that he occasionally used, A. Hidell. So it's obvious he doesn't want these rifles traced back to him, and it becomes clear as to why. But let's take a second to talk about that infamous rifle that was used in this assassination attempt, because it does become a note of contention amongst conspiracy theorists. So the Carcano rifle is a series of Italian bolt-action internal box magazine-fed repeating military rifles and carbines, first introduced in 1891. And to be honest, the 1891 model is very similar to the Mosin Nagant. And we all know the tale or legend or myth about the Mosin Nagant. It's the rifle that can fire a mile. Now that uses a 7.62 by 5.4 cartridge, so it does travel further. And the Mosin is a highly accurate rifle in the right hands. It was infamously used as a sniper rifle throughout much of the 20th century. The Model 1891 Carcano is not that far off. Of course, Oswald, he wasn't using the 1891 model, he was using the 6.5 by 52mm Carcano Model 38 long-barreled rifle, and it had a range of about 250 to 300 yards. So the people say that this shot was impossible. They're absolutely wrong. Even someone who's considered an average shot with a firearm could have made this shot, but I'm getting ahead of myself. And his original intention isn't to assassinate the president at this time. Instead, he had planned on assassinating retired U.S. Major General Edwin Walker. Now, General Walker at the time was an outspoken anti-communist, a segregationist. He was anti-civil rights. He was highly outspoken about this stuff and other extremist right-wing views. And even Attorney General at the time, Robert Kennedy, ordered that he be temporarily held in a mental institution due to an incident involving racial integration at the University of Mississippi, which led to his arrest on charges of insurrection, seditious conspiracy, and other charges. The guy in Lee Harvey Oswald's mind was a right-wing fascist. And when it came to news of this guy, something in Lee Harvey Oswald's mind snapped, because on April 10th, 1963, less than 100 feet away from his window, Lee Harvey Oswald snuck into the guy's yard and fired upon him. However, Oswald actually misses this shot. The bullet struck the window frame, and Walker's only injuries were bullet fragments to his forearm. But as it's been noted before, Oswald was an average shot at best. But at this time, nobody had known that Oswald had taken this shot. He basically gets away with it. It's not until after the Kennedy assassination when he's connected to this through the ballistics evidence and through a subsequent interview with his wife, who later finds a note about 10 days after the Kennedy assassination alluding to this assassination attempt. So after this incident, 1963, Oswald is in New Orleans, and he's becoming part of the Fidel Castro Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He's basically protesting the naval blockade of Cuba and the trade embargo which is being slapped on Cuba. And on May 26, Oswald writes to the New York City headquarters of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, proposing to open up an office in New Orleans, to which they respond, "No, don't do that, that's too soon. Maybe wait before you go investing a whole bunch of time and money into this." But Oswald then writes back, "Well, against your advice, I had decided to do it anyway." And he becomes the one-man New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And he goes to a local printer where he prints out 500 applications, 300 membership cards, and 1,000 leaflets that he hands out. And these leaflets basically are saying hands off Cuba. He's trying to whip up support for Cuba in order to stop this trade embargo, essentially. And I imagine, just like before, when he decided to defect to the Soviet Union, he probably has these grand ambitions that he can be part of this new so-called workers' paradise that was Cuba. And to be honest, this is probably around the time where Kennedy is really on his radar because of Kennedy's hardcore stance against Cuba. And I would imagine that it's probably around this time where he starts formulating a plot to assassinate Kennedy. For most people, that may seem very early in the timeline, but I don't think it's outside of the realm of possibility considering he had already attempted to assassinate this major general. So he's down in New Orleans, he's handing out these hands-off Cuba flyers, and he gets into a scuffle with an anti-Castro militant named Carlos Bengur, who had formed his own anti-Castro organization in New Orleans. And upon all of this, they're all arrested for disturbing the peace. It's at this time when Oswald states that he's part of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which he claimed had 35 members and was led by A.J. Hidell, his alias. Of course, the fact of the matter is this is all in Oswald's head. He was the only member of this branch, and this branch wasn't even chartered by the national organization at the time. And we see up to this point, there's somewhat of a pattern going on in Lee Harvey Oswald's life. It seems that he wants to be not so much famous, but remembered, because when he first defects to the Soviet Union, there's a little bit of media action around that. And it was stated when he and his wife came back to the United States, he was kind of disappointed that there was no media attention drawn to it. And it seems like he wants to be seen as a revolutionary, a radical, or a leader fighting out against this capitalist nation that he hated. He essentially wanted to be a someone. And this all kind of goes back to that mental diagnosis he had back when he was a teen. About a week after this scuffle and this arrest, he's once again handing out these hands-off Cuba flyers, and he catches the attention of some local radio media, where he's interviewed and subsequently participates in a debate. And this is at the time where he's formulating a plan to visit Cuba. However, as an American, you can't just travel to Cuba from America. That's illegal. But it's not illegal if you bounce there through a third country like Mexico, or I think even like places like Jamaica, you can do it. And this prompts Lee Harvey Oswald's trip to Mexico. And once he gets to Mexico City, he applies for a transit visa to the Cuban consulate. He states that he wants to visit Cuba on his way to the Soviet Union, and he's told that you need the Soviet Union's permission to visit Cuba. We're not just going to let you go. So after 5 days of bouncing back and forth between the Cuban and the Soviet consulates, and at one point even getting into an argument with a Cuban consular, they flat out tell him no, stating that a person like Oswald, in place of aiding the Cuban Revolution, was doing it more harm than good. They basically knew they were dealing with a crazy guy, and they weren't looking for that kind of attention. Now, eventually, on October 18th, they do approve his travel visa. However, he had given up on this plan of visiting Cuba, and the Soviet Union was already back in the United States. Of course, according to CIA documents released in 2017, it's believed that he was setting all this up because he was already planning the assassination, and he had planned to travel to Mexico, then Cuba, then the Soviet Union after the assassination, hoping to emerge as some kind of hero. Of course, I think if that had happened, the second he stepped foot on Cuban soil, they would have arrested him and sent his ass back to the United States, because the last thing even the Soviets wanted at the time was World War III to break out. Because remember, this is the time when tensions with the Soviet Union were at its peak, and a gunshot like that could have sparked World War III, especially if the Soviets had decided to harbor the assassin afterwards. And even though the Soviets were our adversaries and rivals, they weren't fucking stupid or insane. So in early October, Oswald returns to Dallas. And through some friends of his wife, he is informed about an opening at the Texas School Book Depository as an order filler, making $1.25 an hour, which was Kennedy's new minimum wage, part of his New Frontier plan to raise the minimum wage. So he interviews and he's hired on October 16th. And his supervisor would even go on to say that he did a good day's work and was an above average employee. So during the work week, he's spending his time at a rooming house where he is staying under the name O.H. Lee. And on the weekends, he travels to Irving, where his wife was staying, in order to spend time with her. She was pregnant with their second daughter at the time. She was actually born on October 20th. And at this time, they're basically just keeping up this routine. Of course, at this time, the Dallas branch of the FBI really becomes interested in Oswald, mostly due to these trips to the Soviet embassy in Mexico. They think it's a possible espionage case. And the FBI visited the house where his wife was staying, this lady named Mrs. Payne, a friend of hers, twice in order to interview Lee. However, he's not there. He's at work in Dallas. And when he finds out about this, he's furious. He goes to the FBI office and he requests to see Agent James P. Hotsey, who was part of this little investigation. Now, when he was told Hotsey was unavailable, Oswald left a note that, according to the receptionist, read, quote, "Let this be a warning. I will blow up the FBI and the Dallas Police Department if you don't stop bothering my wife. Signed, Lee Harvey Oswald." Which a lot of contemporaries take this side of it, and they say that this was a direct threat. However, according to Hotsey later, the note read, "If you have anything you want to learn about me, come talk to me directly. If you don't cease bothering my wife, I will take the appropriate action and report this to the proper authorities." However, we don't know exactly what the note said because after the assassination, Hotsey was ordered by his superiors to destroy that note. And at this point, we are only days from the assassination. And I believe at this point is when he went all in and said, "I'm going to assassinate the President of the United States" when he comes through Dallas. Because at the time, Kennedy, he was on the campaign trail. He was gearing up for his re-election, and Dallas, Texas was one of those crucial stops because he needed that Southern Democratic support, especially concerning how close his previous campaign was. And in the days before Kennedy's arrival in Dallas, several newspapers published the route of Kennedy's motorcade. This was because they were expecting a huge turnout. He was a popular president at the time. And seeing an opportunity, Oswald decides that, hey, it's now or never. So Oswald didn't drive. He had his buddy, a man named Frazier, who was also a co-worker, take him back and forth to Irving on the weekends. So on that Thursday, he asks Frazier, "Hey, can you take me back to Irving? I gotta go pick up some curtain rods." And Frazier, not thinking anything of it, says, "Yeah, sure, I'll give you a lift." So he goes back, he picks up these curtain rods. They're in a long brown paper bag. And they return to Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, the morning of the assassination, and they go to work. And at this point, I'm going to go through the morning of the assassination step by step. So in 1963, Kennedy decided to travel to Texas to smooth over frictions in the state's Democratic Party between U.S. Liberal Senator Ralph Yarborough and a conservative governor, John Connally. This meeting was agreed to. By November 18th, it was announced, and the motorcade route was finalized because this was going to be the informal launch of his 1964 presidential campaign. He's really trying to keep the Democratic Party together at this point because he needs those votes. And this becomes a big event for Dallas. They ramp up security and they finalize all the details. On November 21st, 11:07 p.m., Air Force One lands at Caswell Air Force Base on the outskirts of Fort Worth. The president and his wife are met by Raymond Buck, president of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce, and his wife. Air Force Two then lands at Carswell with the vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, Texas Governor John Connally, and Senator Ralph Yarborough. At 11:35 p.m., the Kennedys arrive at the Hotel Texas in Fort Worth, and they reside in room 850 for the night. On Friday, November 22nd, 1963, 7:23 a.m. Central Standard Time, Oswald and his friend Frazier arrive at the Texas School Book Depository for their shift. And Oswald is carrying the large paper wrap package in his arms, which Frazier believes is just curtain rods. At 8:45 a.m., the president speaks during breakfast in a square across 8th Street to the Chamber of Commerce. At 9:10 a.m., Kennedy takes his place in the Hotel Texas Grand Ballroom for a scheduled speech, and afterwards, presidential advisor Kenny O'Donnell informs Roy Kellerman, the Secret Service agent in charge of the trip, that the protective bubble top on the presidential limousine shouldn't be equipped if the weather is clear. At 10:40 a.m., Kennedy's motorcade departs Hotel Texas for the Carswell Air Force Base. At 11:20 a.m., Air Force One departs Carswell Air Force Base for Dallas, Texas. By 11:38 a.m., Air Force 2 and 1 both arrive at Love Field in Dallas. At 11:55 a.m., the motorcade departs Love Field for its 10-mile trip through downtown Dallas. The motorcade route took a left turn from the south end of Love Field to West Mockingbird Lane and continued through to central Dallas as it progressed down Main Street. At 12:29 p.m., the motorcade turned right into Houston Street, entering Dealey Plaza as it approached the Texas School Book Depository. At 12:30 on the dot, the presidential limousine turned onto Elm Street. At this time, Kennedy had started waving his right hand, and then 3 shots rang out. The first shot was a miss. The second shot hits Kennedy in the back of the neck, and the bullet comes out of his throat. And the bullet eventually lodges into Colony. Now, according to the Zapruder film, which caught this incident right up close, the president is temporarily hidden from view by the Stemmons freeway sign, and this was just due to where Zapruder was standing. Now, between frames 215 and 225 of this, we see him with an anguished expression on his face and his mouth open wide. At this point, his hands clenched into fists, and he raised the fists in front of his face and throat as he turned left towards his wife. At this point, Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who was on the running board of the car behind him, after hearing the shot, runs to Kennedy's car in front of him. About a quarter second later, at frame 313, Kennedy is hit a second time and his head literally explodes. By this time, Hill is sprinting towards the presidential limo. At this point, Jackie reaches back and she literally scoops his brains off of the back of the limousine. At the same time, Hill manages to climb aboard the limousine and he shields the president and Mrs. Kennedy with his body as it starts to accelerate and it takes off at 80 miles per hour towards Parkland Hospital. And the colonies who are riding with them stated they heard Mrs. Kennedy shout, "I have his brains in my hand." Now, skipping back about an hour, we do get 2 different accounts from one of Oswald's co-workers. A man named Charles Givens testifies to the FBI the day after the assassination that he had spotted Oswald on the 6th floor of the depository alone at around 11:30 a.m. He then states that he spotted Oswald reading a newspaper in the first floor domino room at 11:50 a.m. 20 minutes later. However, when he mentions this to the Warren Commission, he states that he spotted Oswald alone at 11:55 a.m. on the 6th floor of the depository. Now, he may have ran into him 3 times in this half hour, we don't know. I think he just got his times mixed up, but I digress. Another co-worker, William Shelley, a foreman at the depository, testified that he saw Oswald near the telephone on the first floor between 11:45 and 11:50 a.m. And a janitor who worked there, a man named Eddie Piper, testified that he spoke to Oswald on the first floor at 12 p.m. Another co-worker, Bonnie Ray Williams, was eating his lunch on the 6th floor of the depository and was there till at least 12:10. He said that during that time he did not see Oswald or anyone else on the 6th floor and thought he was the only person up there. However, he does go on to state that he did see some boxes in the southwest corner stacked up around what would become the sniper's nest. And he states that these boxes may have prevented him from even realizing Oswald was up there. Other workers would testify that between 12 and 12:30 that he was not seen in either the first or second floor lunchrooms when many people were taking their midday break. But what we do know for sure is after 12:10 p.m., Lee Harvey Oswald is up there on the 6th floor by himself. And at 12:30 p.m., Oswald fires 3 shots from the southwest corner window of the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. The first shot ends up missing entirely. It hits the cobblestones. And we know this because a bystander by the name of James Teague received a minor facial injury from a small piece of curbstone that had fragmented after it was struck by one of the bullets, possibly the first one. However, the second and third shots do make its target. And by the time the third shot rains out, chaos has ensued. The motorcade is speeding away towards the hospital at 80 miles per hour. So as the motorcade is speeding through Dealey Plaza, panic ensues. A lot of witnesses are diving for cover because they're thinking there's a madman on a shooting spree. And already at this point, nobody really knows or is quite sure where the gunfire is coming from. A lot of people believe it's coming from the infamous grassy knoll. However, we find out that that's pretty much impossible because just mere seconds after all this chaos is reigning, police officers and others run up there to the grassy knoll and they're searching the fence, and there's no sign of a gunman or a sniper's nest. They were extremely quick about it in the moment, and any sniper wouldn't have been able to just disappear like that. However, among the witnesses who would later testify in the Warren Commission, there were 178 witnesses who testified. 78 were unsure of the shot's origin, 49 believed that the shots came from the depository, and 21 thought they came from the grassy knoll. However, no witnesses ever reported seeing anyone with or without a gun immediately behind the knoll's picket fence at any time during, before, or after the shooting. But this general ignorance of where the bullet comes from is kind of the spark of that early conspiracy theory of a second shooter. Everybody believes that it was a second shooter. And the fact that nobody really knows where this shot rang out from, it comes from a general lack of the public's understanding of basic ballistics. Firearms and ballistics are an extremely simple science when you really get down to it, but I would say 95% of people out there don't know the first thing about guns. They think guns are some kind of magical device. They don't know the first thing about ballistics or how a bullet impacting the body is going to affect the body. So it's really easy for somebody who's never even held a firearm in their lives or have even shot a firearm would be very confused about certain aspects when it comes to general ballistics. And even further evidence to suggest that nobody was on or near the grassy knoll at the time, a man named Lee Bowers, he was in a 2-story railroad switch tower 120 yards or about 110 meters behind the grassy knoll's picket fence. He was watching the motorcade and had an unobstructed view of the only route by which the shooter could flee the grassy knoll, and he saw no one leaving the scene. Now, while he did testify that he did see 1 or 2 men kind of milling about in between himself and the grassy knoll, one was a parking lot attendant who he was familiar with, and another said that he was dressed like a custodian from a local courthouse. He did see that he saw some commotion around the grassy knoll as the assassination was happening. However, this was most likely those police officers and those people who immediately went over there to kind of investigate to see if that shot had come from the grassy knoll. However, conspiracy theorists latch onto this too. But the truth is, when you look at the actual ballistics and the trajectory of the bullets, where they were going and where they're coming from, it all really makes sense that it was coming from that 6-story window of the Texas School Book Depository. Now, a lot of people say, well, Kennedy's head jerked back and went to the left, indicating that he was shot from the front. Well, that simply isn't true. When you get hit by a bullet in the neck or the back of the head, your body locks up and your head jerks back. It's a very simple reflex. And that reflex took place as Kennedy was shot through the neck. His body locked up, he brought his arms up, his head went back and to the left. Now, his second shot was where his head basically explodes, and to be honest, when you look at the trajectory of the bullets, this was almost a miss. And as I said before, Oswald, he wasn't the greatest shot in the world. Even back in his Marine days when he was qualifying on the training ranges, people would say that he didn't really necessarily care if he hit his targets or not. But the second bullet really glances the top of his skull and pretty much blows the top of his skull off. If Oswald had just been aiming just a hair higher, he would have missed entirely. He would have ended up shooting over the president's head. But to be honest, it was a pretty crazy shot. It was a moving target. It was very small. A lot of people don't aim for the head when they aim for a target. And while he wasn't the best shot in the world, he was a good enough shot where this isn't an impossible shot. But I think just personally as a shooter, he got a little lucky on this one. The drop on the bullet was just enough to where it easily found its target. But regardless, this shot took place and the limousine is speeding through the plaza on its way to the hospital. And at first, everybody's running around confused. They don't know where this shot rang out from. They thought there was an active shooter or sniper somewhere in the area. So at 12:33, just 3 minutes after the shooting, Oswald leaves the Texas Schoolbook Depository through its front door. Now in that 3 minutes between 12:30 and 12:33, while Oswald's coming down the stairs, he is confronted by a patrolman named Marion Baker in the second floor lunchroom. However, Oswald's superintendent, a man named Roy, was there, and he vouched for him. He said, "No, this is an employee. You're crazy. Let him go." Right after this, he exits the building through the second floor business office. At 12:36, Kennedy's limousine arrives at Parkland Memorial Hospital, and they get right to work. They perform a tracheotomy and CPR. However, it's very apparent that the wounds were too severe to be survivable. At 12:40 p.m., CBS anchorman Walter Cronkite, he comes onto the news with his famous newscast informing the world that the president had been shot. Now, between 12:33 p.m. and 12:50 p.m., the Texas Schoolbook Depository is locked down. And this comes from the fact that around 12:36, a man informed a police officer that he saw a, quote, colored man up in the 6th floor window of the Texas Schoolbook Depository with a firearm just moments before. By 1 p.m., the surgeons working on the president officially pronounce him to be dead. And at this time, they're scrambling. They don't even know at this time whether or not to pronounce the president dead on the national news, because they don't know if this is just a one-off assassination or a full-blown attack on the whole of the American government. It all kind of reminds me of when 9/11 happened. I remember we were watching the towers get hit, and then we watched the Pentagon get hit, and they were grounding all the airplanes in the nation. And we spent the rest of the day not knowing if other attacks were going to happen elsewhere across the nation. Even in those moments, right after receiving word of the president's death, White House Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff entered the room where President Johnson was sitting. Of course, at this moment, he's still technically vice president. Quote, "Mr. President, I have to announce the death of President Kennedy. Is it okay with you that the announcement be made now?" And Johnson, he states that he doesn't want the announcement to be made until after they had left the hospital. Johnson literally tells him, "I think we'd better get out of here before you announce it. We don't know whether this is a worldwide conspiracy, whether they were after me as well as President Kennedy, or whether they're after Speaker McCormick or Senator Hayden. We just don't know." So to be honest, he's erring on the side of caution. And I bet his first instincts were telling him that this could possibly be a Soviet attempt at wiping out a whole slew of American political figures. So while all this is going on and they're preparing to leave the hospital and get back to Washington, Oswald has slipped out of the Texas Schoolbook Depository and he walks 7 blocks before boarding a bus. However, this bus became ensnarled in traffic, so he exits the bus and walks to a nearby bus station and hires a taxi. He asked the driver to stop several blocks past his rooming house at 1026 North Beckley Avenue, and then he turned around and walked back to his house, arriving there at 1 p.m. So Oswald goes to this rooming house and he's only there until 1:04. He literally goes there most likely just to pick up his gun. Remember, he's got that little .38 pistol. So Oswald takes off, and less than a mile from this rooming house, he's confronted by an officer who is told to be on the lookout of a suspicious-looking guy fitting this description. So Officer J.D. Tippett, he's at the intersection of 10th Street and Patton Avenue. He spots Oswald. He gets out and confronts him. And he says, "Hey, you look like the guy who everybody's looking for, who they're claiming shot the president. I need to ask you a few questions. Where have you been for the last hour?" So as Tippett goes to open the door to his car and walks around the front, Oswald, he pulls out that .38 and he shoots him 3 times in the chest. And as he lay on the ground, Oswald walked over and casually shot him in the temple, killing him instantly. And Oswald does this in broad daylight in front of like 12 witnesses, 5 of which who would later positively identify him in a police lineup. So not long after this, at 1:26 p.m., Lyndon Johnson departs Parkland Memorial Hospital for Love Field to get back on Air Force One. At 1:33 p.m., White House Assistant Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff, who's still at Parkland Memorial Hospital, is outside the hospital, and he announces President John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 p.m. Central Standard Time today here in Dallas. He died of a gunshot wound to the brain. I have no other details regarding the assassination of the president. So at 1:35, after killing Tippit, Oswald is seen traveling on foot toward the Texas Theater on West Jefferson Boulevard. So as he's walking by, he passes by Hardy's shoe store, and the manager of the shoe store, a man named Johnny Calvin Brewer, I wonder who he assassinated to get 3 names, notices Oswald ducking into the entranceway of his store as the police drove by with their sirens blaring. Now, Brewer, thinking there's something off about this guy, he kind of follows him out as he leaves, and he sees him sneak into the nearby Texas Theater without paying. So Brewer's like, you know what, fuck that guy. He just walked into that theater without paying. I'm going to call the cops on him. Which in hindsight, I guess is a good idea because this is the assassin, but at the same time, I'm like, dude, mind your fucking business. So at 1:38 p.m., while Oswald's in this theater, Cronkite comes back on the air and he announces that Kennedy is dead and Johnson will be sworn in as the new president. At 1:40 p.m., Johnson, he phones Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, Jack's little brother, to express his condolences and asks him where he should take the oath of office. They're already hammering out these details within these minutes because they need to remind the nation that the government is still here and this is how the peaceful transfer of power works, and that this isn't some worldwide Soviet conspiracy to basically end America. So they are rapidly going through these contingency plans. Now by 1:45 p.m., 15 police officers show up and surround the movie theater where Oswald is hiding. At 1:50 p.m., the policemen enter the theater and attempt to arrest Oswald. He initially resists. He punches one police officer and attempts to fire at another while yelling, "It's all over now." However, by 1:51 p.m., just 1 minute later, he is in custody. Just 9 minutes after Oswald is in custody, Kennedy's body was removed from Parkland Hospital and driven to Air Force One at Love Field. And this kicks off a fight between Kennedy's special assistant, a man named Ken O'Donnell, backed by his Secret Service, and the medical examiner, Earl Rose, along with the Justice of the Peace. Because according to Texas state law, Kennedy's body wasn't allowed to leave the state before a proper medical examination could be performed by a Dallas coroner. So the removal of his body from Texas was technically illegal, but it's like, well, what the fuck are you gonna do? He's the president of the United States. He's Jack Kennedy, for Christ's sake. Of course, by 2 p.m., they have Oswald in custody, and according to paraffin tests, which I think are like GSR tests, gunshot residue tests, they're able to confirm that Oswald had fired a weapon recently. Now, initially they have him in there because, for one, he kind of looks like the assassin, and for two, they know he's the guy who just shot this police officer. And they have extremely strong reason to believe that these two incidents are connected. So Oswald's in custody, and at 2:10 p.m., Abraham Zapruder arrives at WFAA-TV in Dallas, and he's interviewed about his film, which later becomes the Zapruder film, which we briefly touched on earlier. And this is like the most up-close definitive evidence we have showing the assassination. 3 minutes later, police find the weapon used to kill the president on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. By 2:30, the police start interrogating Oswald on the assassination, and this interrogation would go on for almost 12 hours. During the course of the interrogation, the police come in with photos, which were, I think, taken by his wife, of him holding the rifle and the revolver, and Oswald sneers. He says, "These are fake photographs. You police are corrupt. You just superimpose that photo of that rifle and that revolver onto a photo of me. You're setting me up as a patsy. You just want a fall guy for the assassin for the president. You're all basically full of it, and I'm not answering any more questions." At this same time, at 2:38 p.m., Johnson is sworn in as president by federal judge Sarah Hughes on Air Force One. And it's that famous scene where they're all crowded onto this plane. Johnson's standing there taking the oath of office while Jackie's standing there still covered in the blood and brains of her dead husband after she announced that she wanted the world to see what they had done to her husband. And this swearing in ceremony is very sweet. I mean, they're literally loading Jack onto the airplane into the cargo hold during this time, but it's very short-lived. By 2:47, Air Force One departs Love Field to go back to D.C. Later that day, by 7:05 p.m., Oswald is charged with murder with malice in the killing of Officer J.D. Tippit, and by 11:26 p.m. that night, Oswald is charged with the murder of President Kennedy. Of course, the next day, Kennedy's casket is placed in the East Room of the White House, where he lays in repose for 24 hours before being taken to the Capitol, and Johnson issues a national day of mourning. And on November 24th, before live television cameras at 11:21 a.m., Oswald is being transported from the Dallas police headquarters, possibly to jail to await trial, where out of the crowd jumps a local nightclub owner by the name of Jack Ruby, who shoots and mortally wounds him. Oswald is taken to Parkland Memorial Hospital, the exact hospital where Kennedy was taken, where he dies at 1:07 p.m. And that murder leads to a whole can of worms being opened, because now we have no idea why this guy decided to kill the president. Of course, I personally think that he did it just because he wanted to show the world that he was somebody. I mean, sure, he was a communist, sure, he was a political radical, sure, he was crazy, but I think his motivation was primarily based on some kind of fame. I don't think he was trying to spark a revolution or a political uprising, and I think with Kennedy's harsh stance on Cuba, this stoked a lot of that fire in him. Maybe somewhere in his mind he thought that this would lead to a rise in communist rebellion against America, but of course that never happened. This is the 1960s, for Christ's sake. And that's kind of the thing with Oswald. No matter where he was always an outsider looking in. While he yearned to be part of that communist movement, even the communists thought he was just too crazy to deal with, as we discussed earlier. But now in this last segment, we do have to touch on some of the conspiracy theories revolving around the Kennedy assassination. Now, I'm not going to deep dive into a lot of these because, to be honest, a lot of them have been debunked. And most people agree with the Warren Report, which is where I pulled most of this information from today, that is the real account of what happened. And personally, I believe that's the real account of what happened. I think he was just some unhinged crazy guy. But I wouldn't be doing my job if we didn't dive into some of these theories, so let's head towards it. And to be honest, it all really starts with the initial aftermath of the assassination itself. People just don't believe that it's just one lone wolf. Even at the time, during all the chaos, Johnson even states that he thinks that it could be part of something larger, which was why they delayed that announcement of his death for several minutes. And I think the idea that it was just one crazy guy who assassinated the president for some unhinged reason just doesn't play well with the American public, which is why a lot of people think that the Warren Report was all a bunch of made-up garbage. And in the aftermath of all this, hundreds of conspiracy theories have popped up surrounding the presidential assassination. Everything from Soviet sleeper cell agents to second shooters to CIA involvement to J. Edgar Hoover being involved to various other government cover-ups and conspiracies. Some of the stuff gets pretty wild, but just to make things quick, I'm not going to dive into every single detail. But what I can say is definitively, there was no second shooter on the grassy knoll or second shooter anywhere. If there was a second shooter, we would have seen ballistic evidence of that, and ballistic evidence of that just does not exist. Especially when you realize that there were only 3 shots fired, and we can pretty much account for the trajectory of each of these shots. I mean, people have spent literally years studying these shots and recreating these shots, and they've pretty much dialed in the fact that they came from that sniper's nest. And anybody who's ever been up there to the museum now that is a sniper's nest who says, oh, that shot's impossible, it can't be done, well, most of those people have never even fired a firearm in their lives, so what the fuck do they know? Those shots have been scientifically recreated numerous times, and there's tons of data out there to state that those shots were possible and they happened. So let's not dive into all that nonsense because there's no ballistic evidence to state that there was a second shooter. And to be honest, I think a lot of these conspiracies give Oswald a little too much credit concerning his connections in life. He wasn't really seen as some trustworthy government-hired assassin who was going to lead a Soviet rebellion or be trusted in a larger conspiracy like this, even if his role in all this was that of a patsy or a fall guy. I just don't see anybody trusting him with even that responsibility. We have to remember, this guy's mentally unhinged. Even if he was meant to be killed shortly afterwards, he's the last guy you want as a fall guy in a conspiracy. And I can see that that's especially why the CIA would not want anything to do with him, especially considering the fact that he was a Section 8 when he was kicked out of the Marines for defecting to the Soviet Union and telling people, oh, I'm going to give the Soviet Union all of America's secrets. And to be honest, the CIA had no reason to get rid of Kennedy. Kennedy allowed the CIA to rapidly expand and basically do whatever the hell they wanted. Now, he did say no to a few programs because they were considered even too extreme for him, but I just don't see the CIA's motive in wanting Kennedy dead. Now, it was revealed later that the CIA did have some files on Lee Harvey Oswald as well as the FBI, but of course they were going to have files on this guy because he had defected to the Soviet Union at one point, and these agencies were keeping close tabs on anybody who was even suspected of defecting to the Soviet Union at the time. And it was stated that even before and after the assassination, they did tamper with some of those files. But to be honest, they never saw this guy as nothing more than like a wannabe Soviet and possibly crazy guy, a low-level political agitator who was largely ignored. But he's not somebody who the CIA or the FBI is going to go to and be like, hey, come work for us as a secret agent, or hey, come join this assassination plot we have on the president. To be honest, that is all in the realm of fantasy. Of course, moving away from CIA, FBI involvement, other people say that it was a shadow government conspiracy to assassinate the president because under Kennedy, they couldn't escalate military involvement in Vietnam. Which was true. Under Kennedy, military involvement in Vietnam wasn't really direct, it was very tempered. And it really wasn't until LBJ came into office when Vietnam really started to heat up. But then you have to ask the logical question, why would you assassinate your own president in order to ramp up military involvement in Vietnam? What's in it for you? And I guess you can argue, well, the industrial military complex needs to earn a few more dollars. But to be honest, ramped up involvement in Vietnam was gonna happen regardless of who was in the White House. So I don't really see that conspiracy going anywhere. Now, some people will argue that Kennedy was assassinated because he was turning away from the Cold War and trying to establish some kind of peaceful relations with the Soviet Union, and that this was a threat to the growing industrial military complex. But call me naive, but I think even seeking out peaceful relations with the Soviet Union at the time wouldn't have prevented America from going into Vietnam. Like I said, American involvement in that war was going to happen one way or the other. Just because he was seeking to ramp down military involvement didn't mean that it wouldn't spike again if he were out of office. Of course, then there's the alleged mafia involvement, and that really comes from the fact that the Kennedys were from that Boston area, and they worked for like labor rights and stuff, and they were part of that kind of inner Massachusetts corrupt political society, which is stereotypically involved with the mafia. It's mostly a bunch of BS and bunk. Now, it is true that on various occasions, the mafia has directly worked with the CIA on certain projects, mostly because the mafia has a built-in infrastructure for certain activities that they like to involve themselves in. But there was really nothing in it for the mafia to gain, so I don't really see a motive there. And that's the thing I always ask when these theories come up. What do you have to gain when it comes to this assassination? And a lot of the times, those gains aren't there, so the motivations fall apart. Of course, they do allege that one person who did have something to gain was Lyndon B. Johnson, because he had allegedly feared that he would be dropped from the Democratic ticket in this next election. And this was due to that kind of split that was going on in the Democratic Party. You had these more liberal, northeastern New England types and the old Southern Dixiecrat types. But the thing with that theory is Johnson was the counterbalance to Kennedy when it came to this split. Johnson was an old school Texas Democrat, and the last thing Kennedy would have wanted was to dump Johnson from that vice presidential ticket, because if he had been replaced with, let's just say, Robert F. Kennedy, his brother, he would have lost the election because he would have lost the entire Southern vote. So while Johnson technically does have something to gain, that whole idea is just completely ludicrous. Now, while there was some alleged conversations between Kennedy and others about dropping Johnson from the ticket in favor of North Carolina Governor Terry Sanford, I don't think those conversations were as serious as people thought they were. Because remember, when you're in politics, you're having conversations like this every single day with the people around you, because you're always wheeling and dealing to see who you need with you in order to get those votes, get your policies passed, win that next election. And to be honest, Kennedy simply cannot win the 1964 election without somebody like Johnson by his side, unless he went really hardcore old school Dixiecrat. So that conspiracy theory really falls apart very quickly. However, my favorite little conspiracy is the Federal Reserve conspiracy. This theory comes from a book called Crossfire, written by Jim Marrs, and he suggests that Kennedy was trying to rein in the power of the Federal Reserve. We all know who the Federal Reserve is. They're a group of private banks who have an absolute monopoly on American currency. They were created after a bunch of corrupt wheeling and dealing in Congress in the early 1900s by a bunch of corrupt bankers who want to get richer, but I'll save that for a special episode on that topic. On a side note, just because the currency of America is the Federal Reserve note, it's not illegal to accept other forms of currency as payment. So if you wanted to create your own local or state currency, you can do it. There's nothing that the federal government or the Federal Reserve can do about it. And to be honest, local currencies and state currencies do a really good job at boosting local and state economies, but I digress. So this conspiracy theory all starts out with Executive Order 11110, which was issued by President Kennedy on June 4th, 1963. And this executive order delegated the president's authority to issue silver certificates to the Secretary of the Treasury. And we have to remember the Treasury Department is not the Federal Reserve. They're two different entities. One is a series of private banks, and then the Treasury Department is its own separate government entity. Now, the order allowed the Secretary to issue silver certificates if any were needed during the transition period under Kennedy's plan to eliminate silver certificates and just use the Federal Reserve notes. And this was primarily to prop up the economy if the switch over to just using Federal Reserve notes would cause some kind of catastrophic dip in the economy. Now, this was part of a long plan to eventually go off of the gold standard and just switch everything over to a fiat currency, which didn't really happen until the Nixon administration. But apparently somewhere there was this thought that by allowing the Secretary of Treasury to have discretion over this, that it would be a threat to the Federal Reserve's power. However, where he gets this wrong is he assumes that the idea is to replace the Federal Reserve note with silver certificates. But the truth is, even by 1961, silver certificates were on their way out, as the Federal Reserve note took over as the primary national currency. So the conspiracy does come from a misinterpretation of that executive order, but it is really fun to think about that there's this insidious cabal of banks who have a monopoly over a currency, and that like Kennedy is like fighting that cabal decide to assassinate him using like the CIA and the FBI and the Mafia and the KGB and the Soviet Union and Lee Harvey Oswald as a patsy. That's kind of a fun one and one of my favorite ones, but it really just shows you how like misinterpretation of something can twist anything into a conspiracy theory. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other conspiracies out there because remember, this is an American president. Of course, his assassination is going to lead to wild theories as to why, especially when we never are given a clear answer. Because the assassin was dead, like 48, 49 hours later? And since Kennedy and his family were all seen as larger than life figures, the thought that he was taken out just by some crazy 24-year-old low-level nothing who couldn't really maintain a job, who was really yearning for, I don't know, fame. Or if you really look at it, I think he really yearned to be like the figurehead or part of something bigger, like a huge communist movement or something. The thought that that guy, that nothing guy from nowhere, could assassinate the President of the United States, it just seems ludicrous to many Americans. Because at the end of the day, we Americans, we have really cult-like mentalities when it comes to our political figures, especially our presidents. Our presidents and our presidential candidates become our heroes in a weird way. Even though they're just the head of the executive branch, they're really just put in there to sign bills into laws and act as basically our face on the world. A lot of Americans, to be honest, they see presidents in the same light that people would see kings. It's an odd kind of doublethink that happens in all of us. So naturally, especially amongst the dumbest of us, when one of them is killed, we're going to think that there was a larger conspiracy involved in it because it has to be, right? But to be honest, no. 9 times out of 10, it's just some crazy guy. There's no big grand conspiracy, there's no secret cabal, and there's no international players. And to be honest, that's really all I have to say on this subject. I've ranted for about 2 hours now. And I know that there's a massive mountain of stuff that I never touched upon, but maybe in future episodes I'll touch upon some of that other stuff. I just kind of wanted to give a general overview of this whole thing because this is a project that has been thought about and researched and suggested since the very beginning, and I really wanted to do like a general overview before I dove into specific topics, just so I have that foundation so I don't have to keep returning to it in future episodes or providing that context, which if you're a longtime listener, you know that's kind of the style here. We provide the foundations and the context first, then we deep dive into the topics at hand. But with that being said, once again, this is Mike, this is Urban Legends and Mythology. If you like what I'm doing, you can always follow it on Spotify, follow it on any platform you're listening to it on. Spotify just helps out the best. You can always support the show directly by clicking on that link in the description of every episode and following those steps. Share it with your friends, check out the social medias, and check out my second podcast whenever I decide to launch that next year. It's finally coming out. It's nothing like this one. It is really fun. It's short form content. I think a lot of people are going to love it. I recently recorded the initial pilot and some concept episodes, and I think it's going to have a lot of growth and be a lot of fun. But more information on that as it comes up in the future. Also, we are gearing up for our 100th episode. That's going to be awesome, so be sure to check out that too. And as always, I thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.